sitting here with Richard Lobel of Sheldon Lobel Associates. Richard and I go back a long way. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you. Good to be here, Sisto.
It's so great, so great. Your dad was a mentor of mine. Known him from when I first started at Design 36 years ago. He was the glue that fit for us. Every time we had a zoning question, he always took time to speak to us as young architects and guide us through the zoning world. So it's something I never forget. I'm always involved in the zoning advisory committee that your dad has always put together, and we thank him because he's really shaped New York City for me. So I invited you in because everybody wants to know about, what's going on in the zoning world.
That's why I'm here.
That's it.
And I hear every day about Sheldon, about how people appreciate what he's contributed to the industry. He's obviously been around close to 50 years. My grandfather, my mom's father, actually prior to that was chairman of the BSA. So like the family, we go back.
I learned that several years ago when I was given an award from the Zoning Advisory Committee, and it's an honor to be in the same conversation as any Lobel. So we got a couple of hot topics right now. One of them, which I'm glad that you're here because I want to talk to you about it. Recently at a seminar at a networking group, and we talked about office to residential conversion. And, Article 1, Chapter 5 is what they're talking about, which is the rezoning that happened, I guess, 2016, I think it was.
Right.
From 59th Street down about, trying to get these vacant office spaces to residential.
Sure.
So, they did it 7 years ago with a vision. Give us an update of where we are today. Are they going to try to change it some more? And, what are you hearing?
So recently, Dan Garodnick, who's now the chair of city planning, former city council member, came out with a task force. They had some of the brightest people in building and construction sit down and figure out how it was going to happen. Right. So they did this reuse task force and came out with some guidelines, both as far as state legislation and city legislation. And state legislation is that the New York State Legislature has to make amendments to the multiple dwelling law.
Right, and that's where I wanted to lead into after.
Right.
So we'll get back to that because, again, Article 7B and, what's going on in there, it's antiquated.
Correct.
So on the zoning side, they kept referencing back to Article 1, Chapter 5,
right,
because that's really the place where, I guess, the yards got smaller, the courts or whatever, so
correct,
just to make it work. So
right. So and it's also, there's things within the zoning itself merely going after zoning districts, text amendments that aren't even as complicated from a building standpoint, where you're not going to have to worry about light and air in the same way. And so there's, hundreds of thousands of lots in the city that are zoned manufacturing that really can be rezoned to residential.
Sure.
One of the things that the task force talked about, which I thought was interesting, was, as an example, all of this M16 property in Manhattan,
right,
which basically, through an application could be made residentially zoned, and that's a lot of what we do.
I always look at that because there's one item that always stands out in my mind. It's because we do a lot of work for the School Construction Authority, and here we are. They can't get properties 10 years ago. We go to these neighborhoods. They don't have enough classrooms for the kids, but they find a piece of property in an M district.
Right.
And we got to go, and we got to do, there has to be an easier way.
Sure. Yeah, it's the push and pull of zoning. And it's kind of one of the reasons that I love it is because you go in and you are presented with an issue, a problem, a use that you need, and the question is, how are we going to make this work? And there's some absolutes in the city that we know about. There's, for example, industrial business zones, IBZs. The city,
they clarified that.
They clarified that, and they're not interested in, as an example, converting to residential and IBZs.
Right.
But schools, so there's a special permit at BSA where you can go in within 400 feet of a residential district. But you're right. I mean, a lot of the issues that we see and that I see, you can attack them through the zoning, and that's one of the reasons that.
Well, and the beauty about people that are in New York City, they complain about it, right? Oh, it's so stringent. It's so this, it's so that. But yet, if you leave New York City and you go out into the suburbs, and anything you want to do, you got to go in front of a board.
Right.
And you get subjectiveness. You get,
Right.
oh, I don't want that in my back. Well, what does that have to do? So one of the beauties that I remember that a lot of developers from around the world, I'm not just talking, New York City, I'm talking about Texas, California, people come to us from everywhere and say, we want to buy this piece of property in Long Island City. Can you tell us what we can build? And we dive into it and we give them the parameters, and they go, okay, well then who do we go to get this approved? And they're like, do we need to go in front of a board? And no, this is as of right. And they're amazed.
Right.
They're like, how could a city this big not have for you to go to a board? And we're like, no, if you build it to these parameters, you're fine.
Right.
The minute you decide that you don't want to adhere, then you got to go for a special permit. And it's to me, I love it.
Right.
I love it because it gives the developer you could walk through Brooklyn, look at a 50 by 100 lot, open up a book and say, I know what I can build.
Right, 100%. And most of the construction in the city is as of right.
Of course.
Clearly.
Because if it's not as of right, they've written all these volumes, right, that you go back and you think of your dad, you think of Michael Parley, right? You go to Michael Parley, you want to ask him a question about Midtown zoning. He goes, well, I remember when I wrote that. And I'm like, Michael, really? And then he hangs up on me, but that's okay.
Right.
But I love Michael.
Similar to Sandy Hornick, who works with our office, it's the same thing.
Exactly. And those are the guys that had the vision. They understood what government wanted, but they were able to be visionaries, to see that this system with zoning works.
And one of the great things about that, Sisto, is that you really can, as an administration, as a mayor, as administration, as city planning, you can shape what the city will look like. And you can basically go in and, for example, right now, Mayor Adams has his City of Yes proposals and is going in and is attacking it and is amending the text and is rezoning for zoning for sustainability, zoning for affordability, what have you, going in and saying, look, we can, through a stroke of a pen, we're gonna change the fabric of the city. And it's a living, the zoning resolution is a living, breathing document. It is meant to be amended, and it's meant to take care of our issues.
It's not static.
Correct.
It's organic. It's organic because who would have thought that we'd have 77% of the workforce working remotely? Right. So there's a perfect example that you got so much office space, but only a third of the people may be coming in for the week. Right. So they don't need as much space. So you can't. When you're writing these laws or you're looking at these laws or you're contesting them or you're for them, pro or against, it doesn't matter. You can't envision what the world is going to be or what the city will look like in a few months. I was joking around with Lou Madigan when he was here that we talked about, when Greenpoint rezoning happened. Well, I was here before Greenpoint got rezoned in Williamsburg, and we were the first ones in with Steiner on a building. You would have never thought that what it is now, how eclectic it is, how it's got so much flair and it's all meshed together and it's become a new Gotham City in its own neighborhood. And it has its pros and it has its cons, 100%. But just the idea that they were able to see it, they were able to recognize it and create rezoning to allow it. So, one of the topics I always want to talk to you about is, so what's going on with the rezoning? I know there's some hot spots. I know there's some stuff going up in the Bronx, Troggs Neck. Everybody thinks that the Bronx is the forgotten borough, not for me. I go through it every day. I see major changes, manufacturing, residential, commercial. It's just, the whole southern end of the Bronx towards Manhattan is getting, the rezoning there is taking on big buildings, a lot of affordable housing. So tell me what's going on in Troggs Neck.
What I see in Troggs Neck, but also just looking at the city generally, is an understanding that when we go into city planning for any potential rezoning, for a private rezoning, you look at the area and you look at what the area can withstand and whether or not it's appropriately zoned. And as you know, Sisto, the zoning maps were set down in 1961. Many things have changed in the last 3 years.
There's a lot of shaded areas with little things in there, right? And there was a reason there.
And so So to take a look at all of these areas where you are sitting on wide streets, where you've got great transportation,
Right.
and to have zoning which supports 3 to 4 story small multifamily is just doesn't make any sense.
Doesn't make not in this society
Right.
and in this culture today.
And if you look at what our problems are as a city, and you take a look at the fact that a lack of density is really a major issue, and a lack of appropriate density is a major
Correct.
issue.
Appropriate density is key.
And you're going in and you're basically saying, if I'm sitting on an 80, 90, 100-foot wide street and I'm 3 blocks from a subway, it might be appropriate to upzone from an R5.
Correct.
And so those are the most successful applications, both in terms of my clients, individuals who go in and say, we'd like to consider this.
Well, because there's a thought process. It makes sense,
Correct.
right? Because when you do your impact statements, they're going to say, well, how do they get to work? Where do they get to work? Is there enough transportation? Is there enough parking? Is there this? Is there that? And then when you look at it, they all have a common denominator. And a lot of it has to do with transportation.
Correct.
Wide street. Those are like, anything you do has factors.
Right.
And with zoning, those are 2 major contributing factors.
A major factor, and you're talking about Troggs Neck, you're talking about areas of the Bronx that are near trains and that the city will be upzoning. You're talking about areas in Brooklyn like Crown Heights where you've got Atlantic Avenue, which is a wide street close to one of the most central transportation systems in the city. It is an opportunity right now. And Sisto, the way that I view it, because sadly I've been doing this for 20 years, and the way that I view it and the interaction we have with community boards all over the city is that there's process that the city goes through to make
Correct.
the zoning
They don't
change.
just do it with a stroke of a pen.
100%. And there's also politics, and there's also people.
Well, again, one of the common themes that is about this podcast is that I am a huge proponent of the laws of New York City. We just talked about TPAs on my prior episode with Chris, and what did we talk about? A TPA. Is it safe? How many people are in there? The responsibility of the person who gets the TPA permit to make sure that if it's permitted for 400 people, you don't have 403 people, you don't have 500 people, you have 400 people. So the laws are meant to keep this city, and more important, the people safe.
Right.
And zoning is part of that. It's part of making sure that the city meets all of the requirements for a society and for good living and proper living. So, to me, I'm always a proponent that I never believe that things should change radically quickly. There has to be a process. There has to be a review. And yes, there's politics. And sometimes you on the winning side, sometimes you might be on the losing side. But in time, maybe that view that was looked at 10 years ago gets revisited 10 years later with a whole different perspective. So then all of a sudden they're like, let's go.
I walked into community boards 15 years ago, and they would look at me, look at my clients, and kick me out. And those same community boards now, Sisto, it's actually a beautiful thing for the city, are now saying we want this.
Right.
And maybe we have conditions, and maybe we want to talk about,
and rightfully so.
Absolutely. But I am there's a receptivity now to this, which I actually have not seen in years. And it's people are saying, we understand that there's homelessness. We understand that our elderly don't have places they're aging out. We understand that our young people and young families don't have places to live.
Right.
It's like, there was one community board I went to recently in Queens where there was a gentleman, an older gentleman, who got up, and I was asking for a rezoning. In that case, it was from an R4A to an R6A.
But it's a good jump.
Good job. And so the gentleman who was elderly basically looked at his colleagues on the community board and said, "You don't remember 20 years ago we downzoned this to an R4A?" And they said, "Exactly, that was 20 years ago. Like, we need to, if we don't move and if we don't provide homes for our families, then what's the alternative? People are going to move out, which
is already happening.
Already happening, and also, as I've heard before on the podcast, supply and demand. Price pressure is unbelievable.
Yeah. Lou got that.
Yes.
During COVID, everybody left. Prices went down. Now you try to get an apartment. It's just crazy insane.
Yeah.
So having said that, so when we leave New York City, like myself, and we drive up through the Bronx, and we see a lot of construction and a lot of manufacturing along the water, a lot of warehouses coming back, a lot of distribution centers, great projects, bringing jobs, all the great things. And as soon as we cross the Hutchinson River Parkway and we get into the Bronx and we see a train station, we see a high rise.
Right.
And it is a phenomenon.
Right.
It's in Mount Vernon, it's in New Rochelle, it's in Rye, it's in Stamford, Connecticut, where I live. Wherever there's a train, the smaller cities have adapted to this zoning concept.
Right.
The concept is lower zoning density further away from the train and higher density closer to the train. So what happens when they do that? There's a whole effect to that, right, Richard? Because at the end of the day, we started this conversation about, so where do the people go to the supermarket? Where do people go to the deli? So you got this tower that's in Mount Vernon, right next to the train station. But the entire community is prospering from that. Right. The pizza shop, the deli shop, the cleaners. They just took this much land that had 2 people or maybe 10 people, 2 families living in, and put 70 families.
100%. We now when we do developments and we're going in for larger developments, the comments that you get on housing are you get an equal number of comments on, we don't have a place to go for coffee. We need another bank in the neighborhood.
Right.
And so they want to see local services. And I know that you're familiar with the Fresh program, where the city basically incentivized people to create fresh food stores, which was slow to get taken on. And now
we had a few of them, and not one got off the ground 6 or 7 years ago. And now they're getting off the ground.
Now they are, because people understand the trade-off is worth it.
It is. And when we were at one of the seminars, same thing, Office of Residential Conversion, and one gentleman, so as part of this zoning, where's the schools going to go? You're talking about bringing in all of these apartments from office to residential, millions of square feet. Where is the zoning that's going to say, okay, when you bring in so many more people, hundreds of thousands of people and families, where are they going to go to school? Where are they going to shop? Because wherever we go now, you walk down Manhattan, everything says for rent.
Right.
The retail market is terrible right now.
One of the great things about the rezoning process and text amendment process as well through the city is that everything goes through environmental assessment and review.
Of course. And
so there is they look at school seats, they look at local retail
demographics.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that it happens in a way which is balanced. We're never.
I agree.
We're a zoning and land use law firm. We love development and we're pro development, but we're pro responsible development.
Oh, 100%. I always, if you really think back, your dad created laws that shaped the skyline of the city. And in my very first episode, before I even met your dad, I've been doing this will be my 37th year in May. It's a long time. And I remember as a young architect when I was at City College, one of my things was never really to design a building that would shape the landscape, but I just wanted to be part of it. I wanted to be part of the fabric. And when I go back and I look and I see the skyline and I say, wow, I worked on some of the code and zoning issues for that building for New York Hospital, or I worked on that for Steiner Studios, or I worked that for Heatherwood, or whoever it was. There is a feeling of accomplishment, and that's when deep down inside that the zoning and the laws work, because it's a magnificent place.
Very much agreed. And you look at the city and the historic fabric and the fact that you have landmarks and the Landmarks Preservation Commission, but yet you're able to balance that out with modern buildings and modern architecture and super talls and the whole fabric is. If you're a New York architecture type of person, it's just you walk around every day. It's just
you're amazed by it. You just walk around and you look up and you go, wait a second. Who would have thought they're going to build these pencil buildings in Midtown Manhattan? It's like, oh, that's something they're going to do overseas, but they're doing it here. I got a specific question for you, and I never would want to put you on the spot. I see a lot of properties that are city-owned, that are near train stations, that are near bridges, that are near water, that have enormous amounts of FAR. And way back when, many, many, many moons ago, when I was young in this business, they used to sell some of those to developers.
Right.
And then they stopped. And curious to know if under this administration, with the yes type idea, is that something the mayor is thinking about? Things that are, one story, they know it's always going to be a lot for their vehicles,
Right.
but yet it's an R10.
Right. So, some of it is DCAS, the Department of Citywide Administrative Services. And so I think that particularly in the last mayoral administration, there was a lot of pressure on some of the transactions which took place,
Prior.
which were questionable.
Right.
And so now you are in an environment where the city, the area, affordable housing, supportive housing would benefit greatly from getting. So there are RFPs out on we know a lot of sites, particularly in Brooklyn. I actually sit on the board of Canva Housing Ventures.
Yeah, we know Canva. We do their work.
Lovely organization.
Great people.
And so there are RFPs out where basically through the city and state, there's a process whereby you submit your application and they get a hold of these properties.
Correct, but it's strictly for affordable.
For affordable and supportive housing.
Right. So a lot of times we get questions, which is a valid question, which is, hey, I have this site. I'm going to do 75 market, 25 before the 421A, which is a whole other discussion we'll talk about. Hopefully we'll have time for, is that you take the 70-25. So let's say that DCAS will sell them some of the air rights.
Sure.
Why don't they just bump up the affordable side of it? Make them do more.
Right.
If you're gonna, same way that when Canva goes to get a site, they go and they would love to get more too.
Sure.
Right. So, but they're funded. They have different programs to make it work for them because they're a non-for-profit and they do an incredible job and they provide such great services that it's fully affordable. Right. But what I'm saying is there a way to incentivize that where you can get a developer to build more affordable because it was city owned,
right?
Not because you're going to pay X amount per square foot for FAR.
Sure. Yeah, I think the developers who we work with are always, it always seems a lot closer, the margins, than you would expect. And so, I love, one of the reasons that I think 2016 and the zoning text amendments, zoning for quality and affordability were so great is that once they injected mandatory inclusionary housing into the mix, all of a sudden it just unlocked a lot of potential. People they started to take the deal, which was you're going to build 100 units, 25 to 30 of those are going to be affordable.
Right. But the issue right now is it's not incentivized for the developers. So now, unfortunately, the developers I speak to, the circuits that I'm on to go to all of these seminars is the bigger corporations have left New York. They're in, like Lou Madigan said, they're in Jersey City. They're in Philly. They're in Nashville. They're in D.C. They're in other parts because no developer is going to build apartments for free. You just can't do it. It's just too expensive.
They need to reset. They need to
reset.
The city needs to reset because the balance is now just skewed. And it was tight with 421A, and now it's just. I mean, we've been around long enough that we know that it's just rental housing is not going to happen. And by the way, like you and Lou talked about, you will get your luxury condos. Those will still come on the market.
Sure.
And the people who really lose out are those people who would have had their first apartment or would have been able to get out of a homeless shelter in order to come into a low.
And they have the feasibility. And so, segueing into that, back into the, so one of the questions that I had asked to the building department on one of the panels was, so, what incentive is there in the office to residential conversion to provide a portion of it for affordable housing? And there is none. Right. Lou's confirmed that because they're doing a site in Midtown. A whole bunch of other developers are as well. So we've talked to a few others, and there is no proponent. There's no section for them to say, okay, you know what? We'll incentivize this. We're going to do 200 apartments. We'll give you 10%. We'll give you 5%. There's zero right now. But it depends on the sub-district, right?
And there's also the task force, the adaptive reuse task force. There was a suggestion in there that affordable and supportive housing was going to get that bonuses would be available to them,
Which
right? So that basically the same 100 units that a private developer would generate 125 units
for the affordable.
Correct.
Right.
Which is why
I haven't seen one of those yet.
No, not yet. But it's one of the reasons I love working with affordable and supportive housing developers is because they can go in and they basically they'll go through the city's ULURP process, Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, and they'll rezone a property. They'll get a special permit. They'll get a neighborhood consensus, and they'll unlock additional potential to these properties.
Right, because they're putting in the effort and the commitment to make that project feasible for that site and that neighborhood, and take all the advice and all the ideas of the neighborhood and try to. And again, you can't please everyone, but they're open to listening versus just opening the book and saying, okay, I can do this. That's what I'll do.
Right, and also there's been a large push for a lot of religious organizations. So the Brooklyn Borough President's Office formerly had a faith-based initiative where they said, okay, you're a church, you've got the real estate, you're going to pair with the developer, and we're going to support you to rezone the properties. So you're going to get new facilities, residential housing, and importantly, affordability.
We've done a lot of those.
Great projects.
Great, and a great program.
Yes.
Great program. So we go back to office to residential. So
going back to this a lot, Sisto.
Yeah, because you know what? Whenever you have a subject matter expert like yourself, you see it from one side, we see it from another, and then we have the building department the way they see it. We have our developers, they see it one way, and then we got to work with the architects who take what you see, what the building code says, they bring it to us and say, but my developer wants this. You need to look at the zoning side. You need to look at the code side, and then give it to me. We digest it all, and then we go, but we got to hope and pray that our vision is the same vision that the building department and the planning examiner is going to see it the same way. So here we are, 1987, I get out of college. 1991, I'm thrust into the multiple dwelling law because we did a lot of affordable housing, gut rehabs, and of course, that was the book. It as much as you had the building code, anything related to an apartment that was over a certain number of apartments, you had to use the multiple dwelling law. So we flipped through the multiple dwelling law now, and it's 60 years later when they wrote it, and it's pretty much the same. So I had asked the building department at one of the seminars, like, so, there's technology.
Right.
There's new types of air conditioners. There's new types of heating. There's new types of ventilation. We're going back to a book where already clients are coming to us and says, well, can I use this? And we're like, well, it's UL approved, but it doesn't comply with the multiple dwelling law.
Right.
So do you think that the interpretations are going to be that we're going to inundate the building department with reconsiderations about certain things that, because it's antiquated and it's not going to change quickly, because I understand that they're working with the state. So if people don't know the difference, New York City's code is for New York City. It's part of IBC, but it was amended specifically for our city. The multiple dwelling law is a state law that only applies, if I'm correct, I believe I am, it only applies to cities in New York State with more than 1 million people. And the only city in New York right now that has 1 million people is New York City, because Buffalo just fell below.
There you go.
So although I found this out by going to seminars and asking questions and educating myself, because when I opened the book, it says 1 million people. I always used that book. There was never a question, right? And now we go and they have sections of it that are antiquated.
Right.
So what are you hearing from the state, and how is the city and the state going to try to work together so that projects of office to residential, not from the zoning side, but more from the code side, that they're going to update it to make it, easier to do the conversion?
You have a more activist administration right now. So first of all, Jessica Katz, who was appointed as the chief housing officer, talks about the fact that she makes trips to Albany, and there's discussions with the legislature about what changes potentially could be made to the multiple dwelling law. Mm-hmm. And so you are in this difficult position where New York City is governed by New York City zoning, but we are so beholden to the multiple dwelling law, particularly on these large scale office conversions. Yes. And you know, it's great. If you read the task force recommendations, they talk about the fact that, you know, legislature, here's what we need to do.
Right.
And so you're a man of action. I try to be a man of action. Like, the truth of the matter is that people have to do this. People have to lobby the legislature.
Correct.
Rebney has to lobby the legislature.
Correct.
It's
because if not, the law feels as though it's perfectly fine. It worked before. Why won't it work now?
And there are guys who are doing those conversions. It's just for like super large office buildings in really nice areas that are really not going to benefit the most people.
Correct.
You know.
The perfect example is, way back in the day, I always remember that I would go to it and you would always make a mistake, right? So you go to the book and you're working with the architect, and of course, it was an architect who knew his game. That was his or her field was, affordable apartments, and they'd go and they would send you the Article 7B, and you call them up and say, why are you here? This is it was always a 6 family, and he'd say, young man, did you look at the C of O before this? And I go, no. He goes, it was a 3-story office building in the middle of Brooklyn before zoning, and they made it an office. They kept it an office, but now, lo and behold, this non-for-profit is getting this building through eminent domain because they lost it for taxes or whatever, and the nonprofit was able to secure it, and now that they can convert it. Well, I was going to, Chapter 6, and I should have been in Chapter 7. And Chapter 7 wasn't made for 150,000 or 200,000 square foot buildings. They were made, in my opinion, it was really easy to look at it when you did a 25 by 100 or a 50 by 100. You went to them and said, look, you got to take the back of your building down. They're like, what do you mean? Well, you can't have light and air unless you instead of taking 30 feet off, we're going to only have to take 5 feet, put a sprinkler, do this, do that. So now we get to these larger buildings. And, we're talking substantial amount of square footage. So, a foot here and 5 feet there and 10 feet there.
Right.
We're talking, you're going to lose the square footage, so you can't give it back. And if we're thinking about incentivizing, like you said, affordable, that would be great, because then we could go to a Canva and say, look, we have this office building. It's in, it's in Queens. It's been vacant. It's single occupied. You could convert this to excellent housing.
Right.
And this code is going to help you and incentivize it for you to not only not have to take more square footage off, but actually reuse as much as you can. Because that's the home run.
That's the next frontier. That's basically, in a city that is crying out right now for residential units, everybody knows it. I mean, it's right there. There's task force, there's seminars and such. But it now, people really need to act on it, and the multiple dwelling law is really where you want to start.
I mean, right now you can't go to any seminar without this topic, and it's a great topic. To me, I think it's part of what we're going to be. But Richard, this was a pleasure.
Oh, fantastic!
This is a pleasure. You've given us such great insight. They're the best around. I always recommend
your
office.
Very much appreciated. Sisto, we feel the same about you, and love talking zoning anytime.
Oh, great. Love to have you back.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
Pleasure.